There's I suppose, a philosophical reason why it's very important that any regulations that you make are scrutinised adequately by this House. But there are even more practical reasons why it's important that we have that scrutiny. And I want to go into those practical reasons to reinforce the importance of this amendment and to urge people to support this amendment. Minister, as you well know, this bill proposes to roll over the Health Amendment No. 2 Act earlier this year, which was brought in July, which was effectively the act which facilitated COVID passes. In that act, you were given the power to introduce, by regulation, and a regulation that the Dáil can't scrutinise. Yes, it can annul it, or it can leave it in place, but it can't actually debate it, it can't actually scrutinise it, and it can't propose any amendments to it. But in that act, you were given the power to introduce regulations requiring proof of immunity. And proof of immunity was actually defined in the Parent Act, in the act passed democratically by this House. One I opposed because I feared it would be abused. And unfortunately, I believe that it has been, because proof of immunity is set out as an EU COVID certificate, A, B, a document as may be prescribed in written or electronic form issued by a body implementing a vaccination programme, howsoever described, or C, any form of written information or proof verifying in such manner as may be prescribed in relation to the person to whom the document is issued that the person has recovered from COVID-19. So, therefore, this Act envisages three types of proofs of immunity: an EU COVID pass, a vaccine cert, or proof of recovery. Now, the reason that I say that's important is because you, of course, have never given any mention of proof of recovery in the regulations which you've introduced. You've merely confined it to a COVID pass, which, of course, an EU COVID pass, which, of course, was introduced a lot earlier in the year when a lot less was known about immunity. And it was introduced for a specific purpose only, and that was to facilitate travel between member states. And of course, for those who don't have proof of vaccination or can't prove recovery within a tight period of 6 months, they can get an antigen test to enter most EU member states, or in the very special case of Ireland, they can get a PCR test. And that enables them to travel freely. But that will not enable them to access facilities in Ireland, because you, by regulation, notwithstanding that it was clearly envisaged in the bill that proof of recovery would be included, you, by regulation, have limited it to proof of vaccination or a COVID pass, and a COVID pass only facilitates recovery within the last 6 months. Now, that itself is quite important, because NEFIT, at a meeting on the 11th of November, the chair of the Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, quite a mouthful, confirmed that natural immunity is built into and explicit in his modelling. As is standard for these models, infection-induced immunity is assumed to be permanent. So NEFIT modelling that all of these measures that you introduce are introduced in response to is assuming that immunity is permanent. You received, when this was being introduced, now that is a step forward, the idea that immunity is permanent, or any assumption that immunity is permanent, but that is, and sorry, I'm not plucking this out of the sky, I'm plucking this from the published minutes of the NEFIT meeting of the 11th of November. So they're modelling on the basis that immunity is permanent. When you introduced this bill that you're now looking to roll over to the House in July, the advice was that immunity was at least 9 months. And of course, COVID was more recent in July than it is now, so less was known about the duration of immunity. But notwithstanding knowing that immunity was in place for 9 months, you limited COVID passes to persons who had recovered within 6 months. Now, why was that done? Well, that was done to keep people safe, to keep premises safe, etc. But when asked, and I have asked you, where is the evidence that COVID passes make premises safe? And the Taoiseach, who is a medical doctor, I don't know how relevant that is, a lot of people think it's relevant, so he is a medical doctor. He was asked the same question in the Seanad, and he said,
at the very least, they've encouraged more and more people to get vaccinated. I'm not sure we would have reached so high a level of vaccination as 93 or 94% were it not for the COVID pass system. And there's good evidence that countries that have it have higher levels of vaccination. And I think at the very least it's worked on that level. If it hasn't perhaps been as effective as we hoped in terms of transmission, it's certainly been effective in encouraging people to get vaccinated.
So, was the COVID pass, as I asked at the time, about encouraging people to get vaccinated? Was it about coercing people to get vaccinated? Or was it about keeping premises safe? Because the purpose of the legislation, the only power that you have to introduce passes is to make a premise more safe. Not to coerce people or encourage people, depending on, I suppose, how you view it. Not to treat the livelihoods of people who work in the hospitality sector, people who work in bars, up and down the length and breadth of this country, not to treat their livelihoods as collateral damage in an attempt to encourage people to get vaccinated, but rather to make the particular premises safer. And I haven't seen any evidence yet that these COVID passes are making premises safer. And the Taoiseach has only cited that they have worked to encourage people to get vaccinated. But the selfsame minister, Taoiseach, and medical doctor today has said that we might need a fourth booster to make us safe from the latest variant, Omicron. So will you introduce, because I ask you this now because I won't have the power and this Dáil won't have the power to ask you these questions later, because there is no power to scrutinise the regulations you bring in. Deputy Cullinane is proposing that we have that power. I'm supporting that because it's important, because we won't be able to ask you in a couple of days' time, or a couple of weeks' time, or a couple of months' time this question. So I'm asking now, as we consider whether to vote on the amendment, I'm asking you, will it be possible that you will require a booster in order to have a COVID pass, or that you'll require 2 boosters to have a COVID pass? You see, Minister, I think it's very important that you answer that question. If you're not going to agree to an amendment that will enable us to scrutinise that if and when you bring in regulations requiring it, then I think you need to answer that question now. Is this about giving yourself the power to change COVID passes to require further booster shots, 1 more booster shot, 2 more booster shots? Sorry, I'm not plucking this out of the sky. I'm plucking it from what the Taoiseach, a member of the cabinet in which you serve, and a medical doctor has said, and also what he has said on the record of the upper house of this Parliament. So, and I'm also asking, when are you going to acknowledge immunity from recovery? Because it's provided for in the law you introduced, Minister, the law you're now proposing to roll over. It seems to be provided for in the science, or at least the science proposed by those that advise you and those that you introduce regulations in response to, who have said, as is standard for these models, infection-induced immunity is assumed to be permanent. Now, I hadn't read, I have to say, and I try to keep abreast of some of the reports in, for example, the Lancet and the British Medical Journal and places like that. I hadn't read any saying it was permanent. I had read reports saying it was enduring. So if it is enduring, at the very least, or permanent, as the NEFID modelling is based on, are predicated upon, then why, if these people who have recovered are immune or enjoy a degree of immunity at least as great as, if not greater than, vaccinated persons, because we now know, notwithstanding your criticism of Deputy Verona Murphy when she talked about a Lancet report suggesting that vaccine-based immunity waned over time, and it seems that some vaccines wane faster than others, but we know they wane. So why are they being given a pass to enter a premises in order to keep it safe, when we know that their immunity is waning, but somebody whose immunity is more enduring can't enter the premises? Because that is not about public safety. That is about encouraging people to get a vaccine. That is about coercing people to get a vaccine. And that is about holding up the livelihoods of everybody who works in that sector. Will you consider persons who have medical advice not to be vaccinated, that they won't be subject to these COVID pass system, the recovered, and finally, will you rule out that it'll be extended into the future to require boosters and more boosters and more boosters? Thank you.
The Oireachtas already has the power. Either house, the Seanad or this house, can annul any regulation it wants, any time it wants. But the amendments here go much further. The amendments here don't just make these houses the legislative body, which of course they are. They would also make these houses the regulator, because they would, but it's in the amendments, Deputy, every single regulation proposed would have to be voted on and passed by both houses of this Oireachtas, right? So there's a very important democratic safeguard in place, which is the houses, either house, can annul any regulation. But if we were to move to a position where any regulation that the government wants to pass has to be voted on and passed actively by these houses of the Oireachtas, then we've moved into a completely different place where the legislative body actually becomes the regulator. And I'm just going to speak to that in my contribution later on, why that simply doesn't work. Deputy, with regards to the COVID pass, you were asking directly, is it about vaccine uptake or is it about keeping people safe? The rationale is based on keeping people safe. And the rationale, which obviously any of us are free to disagree with, the rationale is that the COVID pass is being applied to higher risk environments. And there is a very real concern that people going into those higher risk environments who are unvaccinated, there are two risks. The first and most important is that they themselves are at much higher risk of serious illness if they are unvaccinated. Secondly, there is a higher transmission risk as well. So they are the two public health rationales for the COVID pass. And then I think you've asked a very important question. I think various deputies have. What about the group of people, not necessarily who choose not to get vaccinated, but who can't be vaccinated? Because we know there are situations where people can't be vaccinated. I'm very happy to keep this under constant review, and I've spoken with the public health officials on it before. The last time we discussed it, the point that was made to me was a lot of the people who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons are actually a lot of the time more vulnerable by virtue of having an underlying condition. And by giving an exemption, what we'd actually be doing is saying to a higher risk individual, here's an exemption for you to go into a higher risk environment, right? And there's a real concern, a genuine concern, and we can debate whether it's right or wrong, but the concern is motivated only by keeping those people safe. So that's the rationale at the moment. I think it's something we need to keep under review for the obvious reasons, some of which have been debated here. With respect to permanent immunity, Deputy, no one is suggesting permanent immunity. Nobody. I know I heard you and I understand the modelling. The point in the modelling was they didn't model the waning, the different curves. So the data we now have, as you're aware, is that the different vaccines wane at to different levels and at different speeds. and I haven't seen exactly what you've said, but my guess, having not seen it, is that there was probably a piece of modelling done by the modelling team that said they simply didn't model in any waning. That's not a judgment as to whether or not there is waning. It might simply have been before they had the ability to do that. But nobody, to be clear, nobody is suggesting these vaccines don't wane. We have incontrovertible evidence, I would suggest, that says that they do wane. Hence the boosters. Hence why the boosters are so important.
You started by saying that the Dáil does have the power to scrutinise and annul regulations. Now, for the avoidance of any doubt, I completely accept that the Dáil has the power to annul regulations, but it doesn't have the power to scrutinise them. And therein lies the problem, because the choice is either to annul or not to annul. And I'm sure that if a motion was put down to annul a regulation, the response from the government would be, chaos will reign because there is no fallback. If you annul this, there is no provision in place immediately after you annul it. In fact, the reason that I'm sure of that is because that's exactly what the government did on the one occasion that a motion was brought to annul a regulation. It was brought by the Rural Independent Group in their private members' time. So there is no possibility to scrutinise, to ask, well, what is the basis for this? Is there a different way we could approach this? Perhaps we could improve this. Perhaps we could change it. There isn't that power. There's the power to annul or not to annul. And that is insufficient. It was insufficient at the very beginning of this COVID pandemic, but we're 2 years into it, and you're looking for powers that go for a further length of time again. We need a little bit of nuance. We need to be able to tease it out, scrutinise it, propose better solutions, because I think, in fairness, Minister, you're not suggesting that you or NEFIT or anybody has a monopoly on wisdom. Surely we can all bring a perspective. It may not always be right, but we can always benefit from listening to other people and other perspectives. And that's why I am supporting this amendment. Minister, you said that the Oireachtas would become the regulator if these amendments were accepted. Now, I think what you meant, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was that the Oireachtas would become the legislator rather than the regulator. But in any event, the Oireachtas becoming the legislator, or the Oireachtas having the power to make laws, isn't a bad thing. That's democracy. That's what we were elected to do. You pointed out that there were 171 regulations passed. Made. Now, with respect, Minister, I would suggest that's part of the problem. Because there's a regulation every couple of days, and people don't know, well, what's lawful, what's not lawful, because it's changing so quickly. And, could I remind you of that time during the summer when nobody knew what was lawful for an outdoor gathering and what wasn't? And it took the Attorney General coming out in a clarification reminiscent of Rudy Giuliani during the Trump years to explain, actually, no, the Taoiseach didn't break the law. Now, the law wasn't what we thought the law was, and the law wasn't what we told you the law was, but actually this is the law, and hey guys, didn't break it. So, if we had maybe less regulations, I'm not saying regulations aren't necessary, but if we had less of them, and there was a bit more thought put into them, and a little bit more scrutiny of them, then maybe the public might have a bit more buy-in, or at least be more aware of what the regulations are. And if the public weren't aware of them, well, at least the Taoiseach would be. And we also need to bear in mind that these regulations aren't just sort of academic matters. These are regulations that affect the lives and the livelihoods of people across this country. And the regulation and the power to bring them in unchecked and unscrutinised is, I say, undemocratic at this point, because it's not necessary. There should be an ability to scrutinise. Minister, you mentioned PQs and all the PQs that you've answered. It was 490 something maybe this week alone. I don't mean to misquote you, but the response that I get to the majority of PQs I ask you is, well, that's a service level matter for the HSE and they'll come back to you in due course. I'm waiting 2 years for the HSE to clarify. We were given a figure of the number of people who died from COVID-19 in the Midwest last May, and I asked, well, was it the primary cause or a secondary cause? Because death certificates differentiate between the two. And it's important, I think, to differentiate because, you can die primarily from COVID or you can die with COVID. And we need to know answers to this. We need to know what the increase in mortality is. I asked a PQ around the incidence of pericarditis and myocarditis, and I got no response whatsoever. I think we do need to know if there's an increase. If there isn't, that's great. But if there is, we need to know about it. So, just because you're answering PQs doesn't mean you're giving an answer to the PQs. I would also go back to this idea that you explained that the rationale for the COVID pass was indeed public safety, notwithstanding what the Taoiseach had said in the Seanad. But I asked a specific question regarding what the Taoiseach had also said, and that was that we may need a third and further boosters may be necessary. So will the COVID pass be limited to people who have had boosters, if that's what's recommended? Will that happen or will it not? I'd like an answer to that, because if this amendment isn't passed, it's something I won't be able to ask you in the future, or at least require an answer to in the future. Will people with natural immunity be allowed access to those premises as is envisaged by the Health Amendment No. 2 Act that you're looking to roll over? That was a specific question I asked which wasn't addressed. I didn't suggest that it's permanent. I said that NEFID modelling was predicated upon infection-induced immunity. It was predicated upon being permanent. I said very clearly that I hadn't read any sort of medical journal to that effect, but I did read medical journals to suggest that it's enduring and that immunity from vaccines wanes. However, the system we have in place is the opposite of that, where persons who have a vaccine-induced immunity have a permanent COVID pass. As it stands, I've asked you if you will be changing that or not, but they have a permanent COVID pass. But whereas persons who have an immunity which is based on recovery have a time-limited one, even though the science suggests that the opposite to be the case. So I'd asked specifically about immunity.